I'd like to thank the French Consulate and the Landscape Architecture Department in the University of British Columbia for inviting me there. I'm very happy and honored to share this evening with you. This gives me the opportunity to submit this overview on the emergence of landscape architecture in France. It is common to date the appearance of landscape architects in urban projects in France to the 1980s. By then, architectural magazines started to address the question and show landscape as project development. I will follow this idea of landscape architecture as a means of thinking urban development, not only as local greening or preservation. Landscape as a method. I will go a little further back in time to present some former steps in the making of this history before the 80s. First, I clarify the context, my approach, its basis, stakes, and method. Then I follow a linear presentation since the beginning of the 20th century up to some recent reflection. But my presentation will focus on the specific time of post-war development, which we call les Trente Glorieuses, the boom years. Histories of landscape architecture generally go quickly through this period, which supposedly lacked interest in landscape and did not involve landscape architects. This is denied by the creation of a specific training in landscape architecture in 1945 at the School of Horticulture in Versailles. It will lead to the creation in 1975 of a course in Versailles. I have been following this clue through two main research programs that led to chapters in these books and journal, but it is little in English. My approach has been mainly based on case studies, on completed projects. These case studies could be deciphered through a few common thematic approaches, such as the context of public policies and of commissioning, figures, their training and professional status, design positions and processes, for instance, about site consideration in project, references, the background, founding, thinking, and design. This will be our critical path in this brief lecture. Our analysis of the places has considered three scales: the territory and the site, the master plan and the open spaces for shared activities, and finally, the level of the practices and materiality. These districts are now submitted to a tough renovation policy program where landscape has been mostly absent from original project to renovation one. So I will add a few words about the ongoing state of the examples shown. As I mentioned, contrary to common belief, this idea of landscape architecture is being built all along the 20th century. I'd like to evoke some French figures starting from the earlier part of the 20th century first. A few words to start about Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier, a seminal figure. Forestier would go beyond Haussmann and Alphonse's reflection, who had given Paris a chain of green spaces together with an independent service in charge of their making and maintenance. He would point out their lack of places for activities and their bad distribution in poor districts. In his book, Large Cities and Park Systems, inspired by Olmsted's works, who had himself been influenced by what he saw in Paris, Forestier explains its reflection on Paris based on a metropolitan park system where every element is linked to all the others by what he called an avenue promenade, similar to the notion of parkways. Each of his projects refers to a subtle art of articulation based on a precise initial historical and geographical analysis and is part of a wider metropolitan town planning. This multi-skilled man, at once engineer and horticulturist, designer and manager, involved in several urbanism committees, offers a modern figure of a multidisciplinary landscape architect, planner, and gardener. We'll evoke him again later. It is important to note that this legacy from the pre-war period will be lively for the coming generation, active after the Second War, especially for those people that will be trained in the new landscape section in Versailles, starting from 1945. They will often refer to Forestier. Another seminal example, initiated during the interwar period, is La Butte Rouge, showing the permanence of the interest for site characteristic in new projects. The Butte Rouge Garden City is part of the beginning of a housing policy involving the creation of 15 garden cities in the Paris region. The landscape architect, André Rius, was involved from the beginning of the project, trained as an architect at the Beaux-Arts School, where he studied landscaping. He took over his father's gardening firm and worked as both a designer and a contractor. He was also the first professor in landscape design at the new landscape section. The neighborhood is organized according to Beaux-Arts composition principles along an east-west pedestrian axis formed perpendicular to the slope that overlooks the whole area. The main squares follow the course of a former stream. La Butte Rouge is now a prize example of how the landscape contributes to the quality of a housing project. Rius's landscape designs resulted in a range of devices accompanying the buildings and open spaces using stone walls supporting trees set on slopes, pine trees, flowering cherry trees, and cherry screens, providing transitions between public and semi-private spaces. Rius referred to what he saw in the German garden suburbs he visited. The district integrates existing trees preserved from the woodland. Buildings are set among oak trees. The pink color of the buildings greatly contributes to the identity and unity of the place. Today, it remains near to its original state and it's considered as a reference, but there is also evidence of a cruel lack of care regarding the existing flora and the open spaces heritage. And former students trained at the section of landscape do remember their visits to La Butte Rouge. Now, let's see the boom years. The creation of the section in landscape and garden art at the School of Horticulture expressed the will to associate landscape to the reconstruction of devastated France, and to combine two types of skills, that of vegetation and horticulture, and that of architecture and design. What have been the actual results? The first thing to note is the parallel between the developing of the profession and the ongoing social housing program in reaction to the housing crisis in France at the time. These big housing districts represented a vast testing ground for young graduates in landscape architecture. Now I will address the boom years in 3 steps corresponding to 3 decades, or a time of adaptation to new conditions first, secondly a time for maturation of a professional fabric, and finally a time of renewal in funding and references. And then articulating with the 80s. Each step will be addressed through one main project, other cases being associated in a minor way to bring precisions. Our example follow also the evolution of social housing public policies from experiments to massive expansion and critique. This will be through 3 main operations, l'Aubépin, La Morlette, and Les Châtillons. In this first example, in this first step, little by little, landscape architect would adapt to new conditions of work, to a new scale of intervention, thanks to the use of new techniques. The Aubépin district in Burgundy, in Chalon-sur-Saône, is part of state housing experimentation during the period of reconstruction. At that time, nobody cared about landscape, as the main focuses were industrializing construction and searching for the best modern housing unit. So the order was vague, something like improve. It is one of the first time that a landscape architect was associated to that type of social housing program. In this former tile fabric, he transformed the clayist excavation into fishing and bathing ponds. Henri Pasquier had been trained at the Dubreuil School, created by Alphand, to accompany the production of his service. Again, the landscape architect was also a contractor, as well as a kind of landscape activist, supporting the role of landscape architects in new modern programs. He contributed to launching the first green department in a public housing office in France, a model often cited and copied. The parallel blocks, following the direction of the sound, surround a huge indented park, a large central space free of traffic. This is a master plan figure appreciated and taken again by landscape architects when later they were involved at the master plan level. The hierarchy of vegetation structure we can observe here is typical of many post-war districts. External moats surround the operation and set the relationships with the limits. They include parking lots and bowling areas. There were geometrical structures, hedges, perennial flower beds near the buildings, and a freer mode farther from the buildings. In this land, unfit for cultivation, Pasquier used site constraints as a set, preserving the thin existing organic layer and the few existing trees. He alternated wide clearings and dense wooded pieces to set the places for open-air activities. In order to face this new scale of intervention, the landscape architect resorted to forestry techniques to guarantee the quality of the planting, its durability, and maximum growth. He provided the protection of forest plants using fences and seabeds of white clover to enrich the soil. This was a key element of the project's success in its long-term thinking, together with the setting of the service for close maintenance. Everywhere since then, in those districts, maintenance budgets have been transferred to security issues. Many hedges and the beds of perennials, of course, did not resist under this reduction. Still today, the southern beach has been transformed into a wildlife protected zone. A range of vegetal devices providing screen effects and successive filters articulate the different spaces, but they have not been observed and copied to set the new highball games, at the bottom image, that have been installed there and encroach on the clearings. The ongoing renovation focuses exclusively on building rehabilitation and will hopefully respect this exceptional outdoor heritage. Precisely, the idea about observing our third scale in the describing method is to point out that landscape architects have offered a range of alternative designs to grids and codes set now to privatize former public spaces. This skill, inherited from garden art, could be better observed and applied, as Pasquier would say. Urbanism means extending in the collective realm what garden art is for individuals. In other projects, landscape architects took up the challenge to reproduce Le Corbusier's sketches. They avoided using edges and were looking for a more naturalistic landscape. Another example corresponding to the following development of mass housing that led to larger operation in that first period is that of Sarcelles, in the north of Paris, where 12,500 units were produced in a single operation over 20 years. Sarcelles has long since been stigmatized by the term sarcellite, an illness invented by journalists in 1965 to characterize the new town blues in these suburban areas. The intervention of the landscape architect fell within the master plan of architects and was intended to compensate for a strict and monotonous grid. Still, the buildings are made of natural stone, and this very green town is only at 15 minutes train ride from Paris. The landscape architect, Jean Camon, was a horticultural engineer trained at the School of Horticulture in Versailles just before the creation of the landscape section. He would adapt his horticultural know-how to the scale of big housing districts. There is a grid of malls and squares around the central park, Kennedy Park. Mastering planting techniques has guaranteed the sustainability of the vegetation stratum, which has today reached maturity and is one of the main explanations for the quality of the area. The buildings are set around open-angled squares that allow visual and mental crossings through space. Again, vegetation is more free inside the blocks. It was precisely this quality which would be lost in the urban renewal project that led to the privatization of former public spaces. In the renovated part of the city, the one gathering social problems and illegal activities, buildings were replaced, except for a small surviving part where the mayor's mother lives. They were replaced by a postmodern architectural housing operation with farms, and all fenced with private outside space. Well, I hope you can see on the picture, its horizontal ground does not follow the natural topography with its slight slope, making crossings and transition impossible. A wall, I'd like to show you this. You see the wall shows the difference in level. A wall highlights this leveling led without interest and understanding for the existing context. Landscape architects have now been called in to create a park, but only a park. They were not associated with the asset of the master plan and the structure of open space. So there is no consistency between the local scale and the wider territorial scale. Now, well, if we sum up of this first part, the landscape architect is still often an entrepreneur. We have seen landscape architects without any specific culture of modern space, using their skills to adapt with pragmatism and invention to the new scale, relying on mechanization of landscaping methods with the use of forest techniques, public works, agricultural seedings. They use the existing constraints as assets for the project. Now for the second decade of the boom years. In the second decade following the war, the social housing policy soon came to be criticized, both through the international criticism of functionalism and Le Corbusier ideas by Team 10, as well as through local oppositions during the new Sudreau ministry. In 1958, willing to address the concerns about mass housing, such as the mentioned Sarcellite, Sudreau created the ZUP, Priority Urban Development Zone, and a committee to reflect about life in big housing districts, where some of our landscape architects were associated. The La Morlette neighborhood in the north of Marseille reflects the search for alternatives to the earlier standard developments. It was designed by local architects that had previously worked on the relationship between climate and architecture and were from the outset associated with the landscape architect Jacques Gare and the artist Bernard Lassus. The local commissioning authorities intended the project to be a model development, bringing together many players, contractor, contracting authorities, doctors, social workers, all joining forces at the start of the project in 1959 for a period of 2 years of meeting during which design was supposed to be prohibited. The landscape architect Jacques Gare was a brilliant early graduate of the landscape section in the second promotion, 1947, and he obtained a PhD in urbanism. Following its PhD, Recreation and Green Space in the Netherlands, and the corresponding internship, Gare became the leading figure for large-scale landscape approaches, which are quite similar to what you can call landscape planning. The project occupied the site of an old Provençal estate. The site's design integrated the existing flora, a lane lined with plane trees, and a small wood composed of evergreen oaks. The buildings are distributed around small stone-paved squares built above underground garage. The structures reflect local architectural forms which respond to the Mediterranean climate, protection against the mistral wind and excessive sunshine, patios, loggias, and passages. Neighborhood drives and passages through the buildings compose a system of paths and links across these steep lands, offering views on the port and hills of Marseille. Together, Gare and Lassus roamed the surrounding countryside to observe the local materials, colors, and atmospheres. In 1962, having worked with the painter Fernand Léger, Lassus created the Center for Environmental Moods, and he will later become a leading design figure in Versailles and a pioneer in landscape theory. For the complex, he created a subtle composition of blues, yellows, and greens that play against the sky and against the plants and soil. The covering in colored glass style is an essential component in defining the spaces of the La Morlette complex. Whether the maintenance of this heritage of planted spaces and colored facades will still be properly maintained in the near future is quite uncertain, in line with the lack of interest of the new residents for the maintenance of this quantity of planted spaces and colored facade. The glass styling on the gabled walls has already been replaced by a simple coating of mineral painting. So at that time, the new generation of graduate professionals was emerging, distinct from entrepreneurs, implementing the building of a professional fabric. These are images from Jacques Gare, PhD, about Netherlands. Remember, in France, our unprotected paysagist title is common to designers and contractors. The first private offices as designers were created at that time, such as Paysage by Gare and colleagues, that would become a place of debate with exchange and visit from numerous foreign interns. They were also involved in the modernization process of the Versailles curriculum, where Gare introduced Bernard Lassus and fought for the creation of a course in ecology. It was led by the atypical figure of Jacques Montaigu, the ethnobotanist who trained Gilles Clément, that you may know. They were inspired by Northern European countries and also Germany, Netherlands, where many of them had been to get complementary education and internship. Places where landscape culture is disseminated in everyday life. They considered the landscape architect as a mediator between man and nature. They would base their approaches on subtle observation of local situation in order to search the best relation between substrates, water collection and plants to guarantee the quality of growth. They would also claim for landscape architects to be associated with the master plan and concentrate at widening the scale of the landscape architect intervention for a territorial scale upstream of projects. So, we step into the last decades in the boom years with two projects showing both, the articulation between two generations for the first project and a renewal in references in the second. The end of the 60s is a time of serious mutation in society and minds, and brought new openings in architecture and urbanism, with a shift back to the search for an urban dimension. A major evolution in practices was brought by the seminal figure of Jacques Simon, demonstrating the autonomy of the landscape project. At the Châtillon, the district master plan reproduced streets around blocks like green rooms around the central square. Born in 1929, trained at the landscape section in 1959, he started as a photographer and took training both in art and horticulture in Sweden and Canada and Versailles. He was invited to teach with Jan Macarg and was a mobile, multiple, essential figure, acknowledged as the founder of the French profession. He received the first Grand Prix du Paysage in 1990 when it was created. A lane of Polonias ran through the project and completed the outdoor green rooms and is still used for outdoor lounge. For him, the landscape architect is not a decorator. Landscape holds a strong and radical power in structuring space. His approach was based on earthworks that reused rubble from the buildings. In addition to the economical consideration, they allow to challenge the role of landscape at as strong a level as architecture did in this big housing district. This was also to avoid possible vegetation fragility. Having worked as a lumberjack in Canada, he did not trust so much vegetation to structure open space. Emotion was also generated by a very sensual and dense vegetal composition with a few resistant tree varieties. The snow poplar brought the space alive with trees and birds. These trees, set in dense clumps, appeared to be dancing on the hilltops, while marking the presence of the many play areas invented by Simon. The entire ground became a vast leisure ground based on earthworks. The hills were lined by a gutter that marked the edge of the asphalt at the foot of the building. This hill corresponded to the scale of the building, evoking a possible horizon and expanding the sense of space while providing a wide variety of uses. Unfortunately, in 1998, the renovation ignored Simon's original intention by erasing of the hills, the introducing of so-called noble trees, such as birch trees, plum trees, and the installing of plant tubs and inner fences. It included a gradual privatization of the spaces. another part became the object of residentialization. In spite of a loss in poetry of and space, the power and pertinence of their initial design remain somehow perceptible. For instance, is this big alley with Polonia and with some earthwork kept. From 1968 to 1982, Simon would also publish 54 numbers of the magazine Espace Vert and 23 illustrated books, critical, technical, recreational works directed to the publics and to all types of professionals. Not inclined much to paperwork, he would often work on site with photos week after week, and thus developed a concrete connection with the place he addressed, together as acting as a designer mastering the site, not only as a mediator. He articulated the passage between the precedent generation that he held in great respect and the following one, after the boom years, through another figure, Simon's contribution. Well, that's also Simon's work, sketching and events. Simon's contribution to the redefinition of practices was inseparable from that of Michel Corajou, whom he trained. Corajou would then spread and echo this principle through 25 years of teaching. The Atelier d'Urbanisme et d'Architecture, AUA, was a multidisciplinary structure created after 1968 by a sociologist in order to reflect the complexity of the art of making buildings. There, Simon and Corajou met. The latter had been trained as a decorator and was mainly involved in politics. He was literally converted into landscape architecture by Simon and would take his place when he left AUA. An example of his work is within AUA is the new district of La Villeneuve to the south of Grenoble that was intended to reflect the changes in society supported by the new mayor. The park here was meant to generate the district, to be the seed of urbanization. In such a district, nature is filtered by geometry through different layers of grids of vegetation. These lines of trees evoke running streams and figures of man-made landscapes. He would say, the landscape architects must give the town the emotive qualities similar to those encountered in nature. The town is a landscape in itself, new nature which carries emotional values comparable to those of natural site. And the landscape architect needs prerogatives for antispaces comparable to those of an architect for built volumes. In this period, there is a shift in references. Corajou was involved in architectural composition, and he reflected on French-style parks, terraces cultivated in the south of Europe, the work footprint of man on earth, inspired also by the work of the Italian architect Vittorio Gergotti. The landscape architect had to master nature, acting more as an artist than as a mediator. At that time, Simon called in Corajou to teach in Versailles. In spite of the involvement of many landscape architects in state developments such as new towns and the associated leisure complexes, the landscape section was meant to close, to give place for a training directed more at the territorial dimension that the former generation was supporting. Starting in 1970, Corajou would train a generation of later recognized professionals in an unstable context. Education was only studio works and field trips in the country landscapes in southern Europe. In this in-between situation, things moved and new bases for teaching and practice were generated. This marked the end of a cycle when the current school in Versailles was created in 1976. It would become independent from horticulture only in 1995, when horticulture left. To complete the cycle, we must evoke a change in Corajou's basis in project design. After taking some distance from the living environment that is so too dominant in former approaches, and with too naturalistic a design, he found, so first more inspired by architectural composition, Corajou would move to a growing interest in living material, plants, ground, water, while working in association with ecology teachers in Versailles. People that are also heirs of this Professor Montaigu we already mentioned. So we have stepped from geometrical composition towards the specificity of living material as the basis of landscape architecture conception, and moved to the leitmotif of the 80s, 90s, revealing the site and its historical and geographical situation. The main parameter would be a public space generating urban development. For instance, Corajou would later say that in Grenoble, he should have designed a project for a plain below the mountains and not hills covering the site that were not consistent with the geography of the site. He was also very surprised when he got to know a project like La Morlette project as carrying an unbelievable interest for local matters at the time. At that time, Corajou would say he designed many hectares without even go on the site. But he said that later on. As we saw, these preceding pioneers addressed the changes of projects in scales and the setting up of new ways of making the landscape. They sought to master or accompany ground and time. Based on landscape practice specificities such as site observation, going beyond the limits, interpreting the original order, using the specificities of living material, controlling the substrate, and modeling the ground for the best welcome of human activities. The winning entry by Corajou, that you see here, in the competition for the suburban park of Le Saussé, in the northeast of Paris, will highlight the work of the new generation. The master plan covered 200 hectares and referred to antique device and garden art inspired by Le Nôtre works that Corajou had been researching about. The Reading of a Garden by André Le Nôtre. So, we have moved now to our last part. And after 1975, we'll see two examples of projects by Alexandre Chemetov. As early as 1983, Alexandre Chemetov would assume the legacy of Forestier's experiments. With the urbanism historian Jean-Louis Cohen, in 1983, I said it, he published The Right to the City, Public Spaces in Barcelona, about Bohige's works, but also revisiting Forestier's work in Barcelona. The district of Les Hauts-de-Bruyères, Heather Heights in Villejuif, is a prize example of this idea of landscape as public space. It was the first time the landscape architect coordinated the whole area. The master plan, where architects were requested to insert their own work. It was an experimental project supported by the developer. It would take 10 years to demonstrate the ability of the landscape approach to federate the role of the different players involved, including technical issues such as collecting rainwater, as you can see the ditches on the image. The project consisted of a combined approach of public spaces where every detail contributed to the making of an urban landscape adapted to this suburban site. Chemetov invented a vocabulary inventorying every situation and using constraints as a set. Surface water collection on ground and from buildings in order to put money in what is seen and not in buried pipes. Combining simple manufactured elements to address different cases. The district also neighbors a county park. Instead of putting a fence, a canal has been created both to collect surface waters and to provide a limit between the park and the district, together a limit and a link. The project was aimed at demonstrating the ability of landscape solution for the commissioner. It is like a pedagogical device aimed at the commissioner. Articulation of scales, between scales, address the issue of assemblage. At that time, landscape architects would appear better skilled than architects and urban designers to address peripheral situations. This proved difficult to address by the means of traditional urban thinking. Among this unconventional situation are against this boom years district that we have seen in the beginning, in the first part. After the 2005 riots, the French government enhanced the funding of the renovation agency in charge of the demolition policy of these districts. Ambitious projects are conducted based on the tabula rasa approach, which is precisely supposed to be denounced. The former buildings are replaced by less dense programs, as we saw in Sarcelles, giving a more traditional image along new streets built from scratch. Operations were conducted without any interest about landscape matters, neither at the time of their creation nor in the renovation programs. So one of our studies provided this analysis at 3 scales, aiming at showing this potential based on 3 scales, integrating territorial and urban scales, considering the structuring open space system, and here observe the devices articulating different spaces. The idea was to show that a landscape approach could deal with nearly any case, including common architectural districts. As preservation cases are focused on modern architecture. So I will show a last example to conclude, showing an example of renovation where the landscape is basing the approach. This is the Hay Plateau, a large housing complex, the Haut du Lièvre, enhanced by an eco-district development operation. It is a major scale project of urban renewal, one of the most ambitious in France, located to the northwest of the city of Nancy in the east of France. Launched in 2004 and entrusted to Alexandre Chemetov, and who got a prize for eco-district. This place remained an agricultural territory until the beginning of the 20th century, when the limestone was exploited. At the end of the 50s, one of the biggest construction of social housing began there, situated at the edge of the plateau, parallel to the hillside and overlooking the town, as you can see on the picture at the top, from the main square of the city here. These 14-floor buildings and 400 meters long, were landmarks in the landscape of the city. And obviously, landscape was really a part of the design of the original architect. The situation, together from the town and from the building, was addressed in this project. After the closure of the quarries from 1985, as you can see on the image below, another layer of intervention was added, offering a pre-greening system that was designed to prepare business districts that were not completed. And this pre-greening system will be used in the new project. This operation was meant to re-establish the links between the inhabitants of the plateau and their territory. And from the beginning, the project was carried out in consultation with all the players, including the renovation agency, which advised to demolish this tough symbolism of post-war modernism. Shemetov refused the expected demolition and fought to associate new expectation, sustainability, and social need, including a jail planned on the plateau. The demolition of a part of the main building, one of the two blocks of the Rue du Lièvre, made it possible to open the plateau towards the city and to develop a landscape relationship between this area and the Meurthe Valley. So they demolished only a small part of it to open it to the view. And the idea is to use the elements of the sites and how it has been shaped over time to propose to create a large complex of public areas implemented on relationship of the district with the hay forest nearby. So the idea is transforming a large housing complex in a large complex of public space, transforming un grand ensemble into un grand ensemble d'espace public. So, which most often is viewed from the outside as the defects or errors, is there restored, transformed, shown in a new light, and became the foundation of the city that we have named the Forest City. Living in the Forest City is one of the ways of living in the big city today. The approach of this project from its origin was part of a sustainable development. The forest penetrates into the district based on the creation of an ecological corridor. A park system following Forestier's ideas was completed, including a naturalist park that took benefit of the existing pre-greening system and include other parks and at a smaller scale, collaborative and shared gardens promoting social ties. So there is a sustainable management of natural resources. Everything that exists on the site is valued and reused. Leveling and earthworks were carried out with material dredged from the quarries. Rainwater from roof and streaming are retrieved in ditches along roads and used for watering planted areas. So this is the naturalist park that has been created taking advantage of the existing pre-greening system, and which is made together with people from the School of Versailles. The garden is maintained regularly by students from the Versailles School together with the Forestry Engineers School in Nancy. So the ecology has been also a founding part of the project. So now I will conclude. It's a little long maybe. We have followed different steps throughout this operation. We have followed recurrent questions specific to landscape practices. I have aimed at bringing landmarks in a genealogy of landscape competency. So relationship to the site, redefinition of the original program, open space vision, use of vegetation, heritage, etc. And in punctual intervention, see that a work led at 3 different scales guarantees the articulation with the territorial and urban scales. The project is based on different aspects of addressing the ground and time dimension. We would also include along the idea of on-site works and experimental knowledge, the idea of a reflection based on practical thinking that is translated from our French term paysagiste. In our last research, we studied, by this prospective history, in addition to bringing knowledge, we would like to disseminate other ways of doing things, taking elements from our last research. These districts represent a sizable area of French territory, and even if not so smart a program for many landscape architects, they also provide a sizable part of ordering works for the next 20 years, including major society issues, where landscape architects could play a major role. Major issues appear today to be those of public spaces, shared spaces, and the specific issue concerning the place of ecology in the projects of landscape architects. Landscape architects, as we've seen, have contributed to enhancing and enriching both issues, relying on practice and thinking based on the idea of articulation and the specificity of living material. In this time of crisis and social change, landscape holds a useful place for dealing with many complex constraints in a renewed reflection. This art of foreseeing the unforeseeable, as Shemetov said, needs to be applied upstream of the project to guarantee its efficiency. Thank you for listening to me.